logic and explanation, the son of two brilliant minds, a child at first who preferred crayons to equations. That child, Franklin Richards, grew into a presence that made the sensible nervous. Where others solved problems, he imagined new worlds and they answered. Whole pocket universes grew like careful paintings at his whim. Laws of physics bent politely to the volume of his attention. He learned painfully and quickly that power without practice is a horror show. He learned that to remake a person was to remake the countless threads that stitched that person to everyone else, that any heroic fix could scissor free something that should remain tied. He learned to mourn his own creations when they wanted to be less than his dream, to feel guilt when a stitched world rejected him. And in that guilt and that care there lived his strength. Franklin's power came not from an abstract hunger for dominion, but from a tender, dangerous willingness to shoulder responsibility, often before he knew how to carry it. Across the skein of realities, another response to crisis took a very different shape. Where Franklin's might was a proliferative answer, create, enfold, heal, cosmic armor Superman was a stabilizing one. He was not a man who simply flew and punched. He was a philosophical instrument wrought into flesh and thought. Born in this telling from the need to answer threats that could rewrite stories themselves, the cosmic armor was an engine of adaptation. He was armor and answer both, a being whose body resembled myth wrought into logic, whose reactions were not just reflex but a sort of ontological calculus. He did not merely resist power, he read it, anticipated its intentions, altered his own parameters so that the threat could not find purchase. Where Franklin's touch made new things, the armor's touch remade the terms by which things could remain things at all. They met because two absolutes do not like to coexist in the same space. Franklin reached toward a horizon he thought he could mend, the alleviation of multiversal suffering by gentle reconfiguration, and in doing so, he began pulling at the seams that held different epistemologies together. His gesture was innocent and enormous, a desire to remove free chronic traumas, to sweep away states of suffering that repeated like bad weather across realities. The cosmic armor perceived more than the immediate intent. It perceived the ripple. It perceived that to erase suffering wholesale was not merely to create a kinder reality, but to erase the friction that allows choice to define selfhood. It saw the dissolution of consequence, the flattening of history, the collapse of moral legibility, and it could not let that happen. What followed before the first burst of light was a conversation that was not calm in tone but precise in intent, a sparring that was philosophical before it became physical. Franklin, young, near omnipotent, trembling with the magnitude of what he was about to do, argued from the inside of compassion. If I can remove the unbearable, he said, why should that not be my duty? If a child never has to know hunger, why make them suffer for the sake of some theoretical agency? His voice brought worlds to attention. Planets slowed their spin as if listening. The armor answered, not with a sermon but with a logic. Meaning arises from constraints, it said in a tone that sounded like a library in a black hole arguing. To be free is different from being unbound. Free will is not merely a mechanism of choice, it is a historical identity. Remove the consequences that inform choice, and you do more than heal. You dissolve the lines around selves. You cannot create a world populated by autonomous beings and then expect them to remain themselves if you retroactively scrub consequence from their lives. They become artifacts, perfect and unliving. Franklin's rebuttal was immediate and human. I refuse that people must be crucified on the altar of narrative to prove something to the universe. Power is a tool. Do I hoard it or do I use it to save? His hand folded and unfolded stars like origami. He was the compassionate absolutist, the kind heart allied to a godlike thumb. To not use the gift would be a moral crime. The armor's counterweight was colder, but not cruel. There is a difference between mercy and erasure. Mercy works within continuity. Erasure collapses continuities into a single curated outcome. That outcome will be coherent only if it is enforced forever, which requires the negation of the unpredictable. To enforce your mercy is to become the author of every identity. You would not grant them freedom, you would impose your image of freedom on them. The question is, who has the right to decide what identity looks like across all possible selves? Franklin watched, and in him the immediate answer was sympathy. He had already been tempted to make the decision, but paradox is not neutral. It is a trap set for any intelligence that moves too fast on compassion alone. He understood viscerally that an act meant to preserve life could also hollow it. He could see the faces of lives he had already rewritten in the past, the unintended consequences, the empty-eyed utopias that had once answered his call and then ceased to be. His power, at its most generous, had nonetheless left wounds, a child saved but never allowed to remember, a culture reformed out of existence. Those memories were, in their own way, constraints. Their argument was not rhetorical theater, it traced the fault lines of what the multiverse could tolerate. Franklin believed in the primacy of relational goods. Alleviating suffering was an ethical first-order duty. The armor believed in the primacy of ontological integrity. The fabric of reality depends on patterns that must be preserved for identity and meaning to persist. Both were right in their domains. Both were inflexible because the stakes were absolute. When argument failed to produce assent, action took over, and action between such contestants is both brutality and dialectic. Franklin moved first in a way that was as honest as it was reckless. He wrenched at the scaffolding of a dozen suffering worlds, making small surgical changes. He unmade wars in single breaths, rewrote histories where tyrants fell asleep and never woke, altered genes so that plague could not take. The immediate effect was astonishing. Anguish calmed, death staggered, celebration rippled like applause across 100 newly healed planets. But even as he sowed, small discrepancies crept through. The texture of memories failed to knit right. Strange new legends arose to explain the changes, and certain creatures who had survived by cunning found their skills rendered obsolete. Adaptation faltered. The armor did not retaliate by slaughter. It adapted. It moved like a proof, testing Franklin's maneuvers and then adjusting parameters so the patterns remained self-consistent. It struck not at flesh but at the grammar Franklin used to rewrite things. It showed him scenes in which the people he had helped were no longer recognizable to themselves. It unspooled the probable futures he had overwritten and pointed at the outcomes he had not intended, the homogenization of culture, a universe that could not surprise itself. The armor's methods were surgical and merciless in their honesty. It offered Franklin a mirror in which the boy could see the world as a flat ornamental object. Franklin, for all his cosmic reach, felt doubt. Not a weakness that diminished him, rather an intrinsic vulnerability that defined him. He loved the universe with the occasional painful affection of a parent. He could not bear the sight of it harmed. But when the armor made him watch what his fixes would cost in terms of autonomy, he found the path forward forked and impossible. That fork between an ethics of salvation and an ethics of being was the true battleground. The clash that followed would be decided not by who could break worlds fastest, but by whose metaphysics could bear scrutiny at the deepest level. When the first blow finally fell, it was not a fist but an argument that the cosmos could not avoid. Is goodness the same as stasis, or is it the capacity for beings to be other than what someone decides for them? The conflict that rose from that question would not be won by wounds alone. It would be won by a reason so practical and so absolute that it could bend Franklin's own benevolence toward restraint. The multiverse watched, and for a breathless span of aeons, the scales tipped, then the armor stepped forward, and the battle began. They struck as a chorus of metaphysics and force. Franklin, at absolute power, unlatched galaxies like doors. He called into being compassionate architectures, eras where famine was a myth, suffering excised like an errant line from a poem. He filled the emptiness with the lightness of things fixed and arranged. The armor met him not with equal proliferation, but with a deeper adaptive counter, an intelligence that did not merely resist, but recontextualized. It took each of Franklin's mercies and showed him the underlying ledger. For every life softened in one dimension, other lines frayed in ways his affection could not anticipate. It used his moral logic against him, forcing him to reconcile that loving everything in the same way had the paradoxical effect of making everything the same. It was a long, heavy fight. It was not won by a single technicality or trick. It was won because the armor could operate on a plane of meaning to translate the question of power into a matrix Franklin could feel. In the end, the armor's victory was not the erasure of Franklin's gifts, it was their reorientation. The armor did what guardianship must do, it curtailed to conserve. It bound Franklin's acts with safeguards that allowed mercy to flourish without dissolving the distinctiveness of those it sought to help. In that binding, the armor made a case for limits, that some freedoms are preserved only when power is disciplined. When the dust settled, Franklin was not destroyed. He was chastened and contained in a way he could understand, given custody of worlds with grooves to guide but not to imprison, taught to let individuals surprise him. The cosmic armor stood, battered and bright. The paradox it had enforced folded into a compromise, not the triumph of stasis over compassion, but the primacy of meaning over benevolent annihilation. It had won because it could protect the possibility of being, while Franklin had sought the immediate relief of suffering. Both were noble impulses. The armor's was the nobler when the metric was not comfort alone, but the continuity of identity and the right of beings to make themselves whole or broken by their own choices. In the quiet afterward, the armor did what sentinels do. It watched. Franklin, quieter now, sat among the small, stubborn suns he could still touch and learned that power, uncompromised by discipline, becomes a kindness that kills. The winner was not simple. The winner was the preservation of the multiverse's ability to surprise, to err, to recover, and most of all, to be more than any single benevolent urge could design. The cosmic armor Superman had done what the universe needed. He proved in action that to adapt to narrative-level threats is to be the last true defense, a deca mercy that would become a cage.